My sister told my parents I dropped out of medical school, a lie that got me cut off for 2 years. They missed my residency graduation and my wedding. Last month, my sister was rushed to the emergency room after a horrific car crash. When her doctor entered the trauma bay, my mother gripped my father's arm so tightly it left bruises. She had no idea the lead trauma surgeon she was staring at was the daughter she threw away like trash. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The piercing wail of the ambulance siren cut through the chaotic hum of the emergency room at Atlanta Memorial Hospital. It was a Tuesday night, and as the head of the ER, was already 12 hours into a brutal shift. I was running on black coffee and adrenaline. The double doors of the ambulance bay burst open, and the paramedics rushed in, pushing a blood-soaked gurney. Right behind them was a man whose voice was loud enough to drown out the heart monitors. It was Connor, my sister Chloe's husband. He was a wealthy finance guy who always thought his skin color and bank account made him the most important person in any room. He was shoving past the triage nurses, his face red with rage and entitlement. "I need a real doctor right now," he screamed, shoving a clipboard off the nurse's station. It clattered loudly against the linoleum floor. "Not a diversity hire. I want the best white doctor in this dump. You people do not know what you are doing." His words echoed through the trauma bay. The nursing staff, all of whom were highly trained professionals of color, froze for a split second before returning to their life-saving duties. They were used to entitled people, but Connor was taking it to an entirely different level. He grabbed the arm of head nurse Clara, tightly shaking her. "I said get me a real doctor. My wife is dying." I was standing in the scrub room, washing the blood of my last patient off my hands. I heard every single word he yelled. I dried my hands, put on a fresh pair of sterile gloves, and tied my surgical mask securely over my face. Only my dark eyes and my locks, tightly secured under a scrub cap, were visible. I pushed through the swinging doors into Trauma Bay 1. The room was a whirlwind of frantic activity. Monitors were beeping wildly. The patient on the table was barely recognizable, her face covered in severe lacerations and blood, but I did not need to see her face. I knew exactly who it was. Chloe, my younger sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Standing in the corner of the room looking terrified and completely out of place were my parents Brenda and Calvin. They were wearing their Sunday best, probably straight from a country club dinner or some fancy church gathering. They looked like they had just stepped out of a catalog, completely contrasting with the blood and trauma surrounding them. When I stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, my mother Brenda locked eyes with me. Even with the surgical mask on, a mother knows her child. Her face went deathly pale. She gripped my father's arm, her manicured nails digging deep into his expensive suit jacket. "Calvin, look," she whispered, her voice trembling with shock. "It is her. What is she doing here?" My father stepped forward, his face twisting into a mixture of confusion and deep disgust. "Simone," he demanded loudly, disrupting the medical team. "What are you doing in that uniform? You need to leave right now before I call the police. You have no right to be here." Connor spun around, letting go of Nurse Clara. He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. "Who is this?" he barked. "This is the drug addict sister you told me about. The one who stole your money and dropped out of school. Get her away from my wife." Brenda took another step forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a fraud," she screamed over the frantic sound of the heart monitor. "You stole our money to buy drugs. You are not a doctor. You are an addict impersonating medical staff. I will have you arrested and thrown in jail." I stood completely still. The entire trauma team stopped what they were doing and looked at me, waiting for my command. They knew exactly who I was, and they were utterly baffled by the scene unfolding before them. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply reached up and pulled my surgical mask down, letting it hang around my neck. I looked my mother dead in the eyes. "I am Dr. Simone Hayes," I said, my voice cold, steady, and echoing through the sudden silence of the room. "I am a board-certified orthopedic trauma surgeon, and I am the head of this emergency department." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. I could see the gears turning in my father's head as he looked down at my hospital badge, the one that clearly stated my title and credentials in bold black letters. Connor's mouth hung wide open. The arrogant finance bro, who had just been demanding a white doctor, was now staring at the black sister-in-law he had spent 2 entire years trashing and disrespecting. I turned my attention fully to Connor. "You are in my hospital now," I told him, stepping closer, so he could see the absolute unyielding authority in my eyes. "You just assaulted my head nurse and insulted my highly trained staff. I should have you thrown in a jail cell right now, but your wife is bleeding out on my operating table. So here is exactly what is going to happen. I am going to save her life because that is my sworn duty. But in this room, I am God. If you want Chloe to survive the night, you will shut your mouth and get out of my trauma bay." Connor tried to speak, but no words came out. His face turned a deep, humiliated shade of purple. My mother started to cry, her fake dramatic tears, the ones she always used to manipulate every situation. "Simone, please, you cannot do this to us. We are your family." I cut her off instantly. "Security." I called out loudly without breaking eye contact with her. 2 large hospital security guards immediately stepped into the room. "Escort these 3 to the family waiting room," I ordered, pointing firmly at my parents and Connor. "If they make a single sound or harass my medical staff again, throw them out onto the street." "You cannot do this to me!" Connor yelled as the guards grabbed him forcefully by the arms. "I will sue this hospital. I will ruin your career." I completely ignored his empty threats. I pulled my surgical mask back up over my face and turned my back on them, facing the operating table. "Scalpel," I said, holding out my right hand. Nurse Clara placed the instrument in my hand with a slight knowing smile. The heavy double doors swung shut behind my screaming family, abruptly cutting off their noise. For the first time in 2 years, I was exactly where I belonged, and I was holding all the power. The surgery took 4 agonizing hours. I repaired 2 broken ribs, a shattered femur, and a collapsed lung. Every single time I made an incision, I thought about the vicious lies Chloe had told. I thought about the freezing Christmas Eve when my parents threw my belongings out into the snow, telling me I was a complete disgrace to the family name. They believed her fake tears over my truth. They chose the comfortable lie because it fit their perfect narrative. They never wanted to believe that their perfect, lighter-skinned daughter could be the actual problem. It was always easier to blame the dark-skinned daughter who never quite fit into their superficial country club world. They cut me off without a second thought, missing my residency graduation and my beautiful wedding to Julian. As I closed the final suture on Chloe's leg, I felt a strange sense of profound calm. I had saved her life. I had done my ethical duty as a physician. But as I peeled off my bloody surgical gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin, Nurse Clara walked over and handed me the preliminary toxicology report. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly, her tone serious, "you might want to look at this right away." I took the printed paper and scanned the test results. A cold, calculated smile slowly spread across my face. Chloe's blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal driving limit. But that was not all. Her system was absolutely flooded with cocaine. The exact same drug she had accused me of stealing their money to buy 2 years ago. The irony was so incredibly thick you could cut it with a scalpel. I walked over to the medical computer station and pulled up her comprehensive patient history. A massive red flag immediately popped up on the digital screen. According to the state pharmacy-controlled substance database, Chloe had been actively visiting multiple shady pain clinics across the city for the past 18 months. But she was not using her own name to get the prescriptions. She was using a fake identification. She was using my name. Simone Hayes. She had stolen my identity to illegally feed her massive addiction. The very addiction she had weaponized to completely destroy my relationship with my parents. I stood alone in the quiet hum of the scrub room holding the physical printout of her damning toxicology report. My family thought they could come into my hospital and treat me like dirt just like they always had. They thought they still held the power to break me down and make me feel small. But they had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the match that was about to burn their perfect, fake little world straight to the ground. I carefully folded the paper, slipped it deep into the pocket of my crisp white doctor coat, and walked out toward the waiting room. It was finally time to give my parents the medical update they had been desperately waiting for. And more importantly, it was time to start collecting the massive emotional debt they owed me. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay sealed shut behind me, cutting off the frantic screams of my parents and the arrogant threats from Connor. The sudden quiet of the room was replaced by the rhythmic and urgent beeping of the electrocardiogram. I turned my back on the drama outside and faced the operating table. Lying before me was the golden child of the family. Chloe was practically unrecognizable. Her designer clothes were shredded and soaked in blood. Her chest was rising and falling in erratic shallow jerks indicating a severe lung compromise. Nurse Clara handed me the scalpel. The cold weight of the surgical steel grounded me. This was my sanctuary. Out there in the waiting room, I was the outcast daughter, but in here, I was the one who controlled the line between life and death. I made the first deep incision down the center of her chest. As the blade parted her skin, the sterile smell of the operating room was suddenly overpowered by a phantom scent. It was the smell of cinnamon pine needles and expensive vanilla candles. My mind violently threw me back to Christmas Eve, exactly 2 years ago. I was standing in my parents' massive living room in front of a towering Christmas tree covered in crystal ornaments. But there was no holiday joy in that room. There was only the sound of Chloe sobbing hysterically into her hands. It was an award-winning performance. She was sitting on the velvet sofa wearing a perfectly pressed silk dress, pointing a trembling finger at me. She told them I had broken into my father's home office and stolen the $150,000 from the family emergency savings account. Clamp I ordered snapping back to the present. Blood was pooling rapidly in Chloe's chest cavity. We needed to find the source of the hemorrhage. Clara slapped the surgical clamp into my palm. I worked quickly securing the ruptured vessels while the monitor chirped faster. The memory of that night pushed its way back into my focus. I remembered standing there in the living room completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her lie. I was in my 3rd year of medical school, surviving on ramen noodles and 3 hours of sleep a night. I had never touched a drug in my life. But Chloe looked at my parents with wide, innocent eyes and told them I was a severe cocaine addict. She spun a wild tale about how I had dropped out of my medical program months ago and was using the stolen money to fund a massive drug habit. I begged my parents to listen to me. I told them to call the university registrar to verify my enrollment. I offered to take a drug test right there on the spot. Suction, I commanded. The surgical vacuum cleared the blood, allowing me to see the splintered bone of her crushed ribs. One of the fragments had punctured her right lung. My father did not want to hear the truth. He never did when it came to his perfect, lighter-skinned daughter. Calvin stood up from his leather armchair, his face completely twisted with rage. He did not ask for proof. He just looked at me with a disgust so deep it felt like a physical blow. He told me I was exactly what he always feared I would become. A failure, a thief, a complete embarrassment to his carefully crafted social image. Then my mother Brenda stepped in to deliver the final killing blow. I will never forget the absolute malice in her voice. She looked at my dark skin and my natural hair, and she spat out words that no mother should ever say. She told me I was the dark stain on this family. She said my darker complexion was the physical embodiment of all my failures and criminal tendencies. She said I lacked the refinement and grace that Chloe possessed. The colorism in her words was not even hidden. It was weaponized, designed to break my spirit into a million unfixable pieces. I carefully extracted the jagged piece of rib bone from Chloe's lung tissue. I was saving the life of the very person who had stood by and watched my soul get crushed. In the operating room, I am required to be impartial, but the human heart does not forget. That Christmas night ended with my father dragging me by my arm to the front door. It was 20 degrees outside and a massive blizzard was burying the city of Atlanta. He opened the heavy oak door and physically pushed me out onto the icy porch. My mother followed carrying 2 black garbage bags filled with my clothes and my expensive medical textbooks. She threw them out into the snow. The heavy books slammed into the icy ground, breaking their spines. "Do not ever come back here," Brenda screamed over the howling wind. "You are dead to us. We have only one daughter now." The heavy door slammed shut and the deadbolt clicked. I was left standing in the freezing snow, wearing only a thin sweater, staring at the warm light glowing from the windows of my childhood home. Inside, Chloe was probably being comforted and coddled. Outside, I was freezing slowly, realizing that the family I loved had just erased me from their lives based on a vicious, calculated lie. I pulled my focus back to the brightly lit surgical field. The lung repair was complete. The internal bleeding had stopped. We were stabilizing the rib cage. My hands moved with absolute precision. I did not shake. I did not falter. I was pouring all of my hard-earned skill into repairing the body of my worst enemy. For 2 years, I had survived on my own. I slept on my friend's couch. I worked double shifts at a diner to pay for my final year of medical school after my parents completely cut off my tuition. I graduated at the very top of my class. I matched into the most competitive trauma surgery residency in the country. I met Julian, a brilliant lawyer who loved me for exactly who I was. I built an empire out of the ashes they left me in. "Time to close," I announced to the surgical team. We began the meticulous process of suturing the layers of muscle and skin back together. As I placed the final stitch securing the wound, the anesthesiologist reported that her vitals were finally stable. The loud, erratic beeping of the monitors transitioned into a slow, steady, rhythmic tone. The immediate danger had passed. Chloe was going to live. I stepped back from the table, exhaling a long breath that fogged up my surgical mask. The tension in my shoulders began to release. I had done my job perfectly. I walked over to the stainless steel sink and stripped off my bloody gloves, throwing them into the red biohazard bin. The cold water felt incredible as I washed my hands up to my elbows. I pulled down my mask, taking in a deep breath of the sterile hospital air. Nurse Clara approached me from behind. She was holding a printed sheet of paper fresh from the laboratory printer. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice low and tight with an emotion I could not quite read. "The preliminary toxicology screen just came back from the lab. I think you need to see this immediately before you go out there to speak with her husband." I dried my hands with a sterile towel and took the paper from her. I scanned the lines of medical data and chemical levels. My eyes locked onto 2 specific rows: blood alcohol content and narcotics. I read the numbers once. Then I read them a second time just to be absolutely sure. A slow, cold smirk spread across my face. The sheer poetic justice of the universe was sitting right there in my hand, printed in black ink. The results were undeniable. Chloe was not just drunk when she crashed her car. Her blood was absolutely saturated with massive amounts of cocaine. The golden child was flying high on the exact same drug she had accused me of stealing their money to buy. I folded the toxicology report and slipped it deep into the pocket of my white coat. The surgery was over, but the real dissection of my family was just about to begin. I stood in the scrub room with the preliminary toxicology report, burning a hole in my pocket. My mind was moving a million miles a minute. Finding cocaine and a massive amount of alcohol in Chloe's system was a poetic twist of fate, but the identity theft alert I had just seen on the computer terminal was a completely different level of danger. This was not just a spoiled girl acting out. This was a calculated federal crime that could have destroyed everything I had built. I needed to know exactly how deep this rabbit hole went before I faced my parents and Connor in the waiting room. I bypassed the main hallway and walked briskly to my private office at the end of the emergency department corridor. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and sat down at my desk. I pulled up the Georgia State Prescription Drug Monitoring Program database. As a senior physician and the head of the department, I had unrestricted access to track controlled substances across the entire state. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I typed in my own full name, my date of birth, and my social security number. I took a deep breath and hit enter. The screen instantly populated with a list so long it made my stomach drop. For a terrifying second, I thought there was a glitch in the hospital system. But as I scrolled down, the undeniable truth stared back at me in harsh, bright pixels. Over the past 2 years, there were over 40 separate prescriptions filled for high-dose oxycodone Percocet and fentanyl patches, all dispensed to a patient named Simone Hayes. But the pharmacy locations were not near my apartment. They were all in Buckhead and Alpharetta, the wealthy suburbs right near the massive estate where Chloe and Connor lived. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. Chloe had not just stolen my identity to buy a few pills. She had been running a full-scale narcotic procurement operation using my clean name to shield herself from the law. While I was sleeping on a lumpy couch eating instant noodles and working consecutive 36-hour shifts to survive being cut off from my family, she was driving her luxury SUV to high-end pharmacies and picking up illegal narcotics. The sheer audacity of it made my blood run ice cold. She knew exactly what she was doing. If she had been pulled over by the police with those pills, the criminal record would have been attached to my name. If the Drug Enforcement Administration had audited those shady pain clinics and flagged the prescriptions, they would have come knocking on my door. One single investigation from the medical board would have instantly revoked my medical license. The career I had bled and starved for, the thousands of hours I spent studying anatomy and surgical techniques, all of it could have been wiped out in an instant because my lighter-skinned perfect sister needed a scapegoat for her severe addiction. She had weaponized my identity. She had stolen my parents, my financial security, and my family support 2 years ago by accusing me of being a drug addict. And then she turned around and used my actual name to become one herself. It was a level of sociopathic manipulation that even I had not expected from her. I did not feel sad. I did not feel the urge to cry over the sister I used to play with as a child. That little girl was dead to me. All I felt now was the cold, calculating precision of a trauma surgeon preparing to amputate a rotting limb. I hit the print button on my computer. The laser printer hummed to life, spitting out page after page of damning, undeniable federal evidence. I gathered the warm papers, tapped them on my desk to align the edges, and slid them into a thick manila folder. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and opened my text messages. I clicked on my husband Julian's name. Julian was not just the love of my life. He was a ruthless, high-powered attorney who specialized in white-collar crime and fraud. We had built our empire together, supporting each other through every late-night study session and grueling courtroom battle. I typed a quick message. Code red, the family is here at the hospital. Chloe was in a bad wreck. I just finished her surgery, but I found something massive. Bring the briefcases and come to the ER immediately. Julian's reply came through less than 10 seconds later. I am on my way, my queen. Give them hell until I get there. I smiled. That was the difference between my marriage and Chloe's marriage. Connor was a screaming entitled parasite who demanded special treatment because of his race and his bank account. Julian was a silent predator in a custom-tailored suit who moved with precision and completely destroyed anyone who dared to threaten his family. I stood up from my desk and took off my bloody surgical scrubs, throwing them into the laundry bin. I changed into a fresh pair of navy blue scrubs and pulled my crisp white doctor coat over my shoulders. I stood in front of the small mirror on my office door and adjusted my collar. I made sure my hospital badge was clipped perfectly to my lapel. Dr. Simone Hayes, head of emergency medicine. I looked at my dark skin and my neatly styled locks, the very features my mother had called a dark stain on the family. They were going to have to look at this dark stain and realize I was the only thing standing between their golden child and the morgue. I grabbed the manila folder and the toxicology report, holding them tightly in my left hand. I unlocked my office door and stepped out into the bustling hallway of the ER. The chaos of the hospital swirled around me. Paramedics were rushing a new patient on a gurney through the double doors. Nurses were calling out blood pressures and medication dosages. But as I walked down the center of the corridor, the staff naturally parted ways for me. They saw the look in my eyes. The fierce, uncompromising energy of a black woman who was completely done, shrinking herself to make other people comfortable. I approached the private family consultation room situated at the far end of the waiting area. It was a soundproof room with frosted glass walls designed for delivering sensitive medical news to grieving families. Through the glass, I could see the blurry silhouettes of my parents and Connor. Connor was pacing frantically back and forth, waving his phone in the air, likely trying to get hold of some expensive lawyer to sue my hospital. My mother Brenda was sitting on a plush couch, dramatically leaning against my father Calvin, wiping fake tears from her eyes with a tissue. They looked so incredibly fragile. A fake, perfect family built on a foundation of lies, stolen money, and deep-rooted colorism. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They threw me out into the freezing snow and told me I was a failure, because it was easier than admitting their favorite daughter was deeply flawed. Now they were trapped in my domain. They were breathing my air. And they were about to realize that the daughter they threw away was holding the absolute power to legally and financially destroy them. I placed my hand on the cold metal handle of the consultation room door. I did not knock. I pushed the door open with a forceful shove, stepping into the room with my head held high. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing us inside. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. It was time to collect my debts. I stepped into the family consultation room, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing the four of us inside. The air in the small room was thick with tension and the cloying smell of my mother's expensive gardenia perfume. It was a scent that immediately brought back a rush of terrible childhood memories of being told to sit quietly in the corner while Chloe was paraded around for guests. Connor stopped his frantic pacing immediately. He glared at me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure entitlement and uncontrolled rage. My father, Calvin, stood up from the plush leather sofa, straightening his designer silk tie as if he were preparing for a high-stakes corporate board meeting rather than hearing if his daughter was going to live or die. My mother Brenda remained seated, clutching a damp tissue perfectly poised in her role as the tragic suffering matriarch. I stood near the door, my posture perfectly straight, holding the thick manila folder and my clipboard against my chest. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not extend my hands to them in a gesture of familial warmth. I was there strictly as the head of trauma surgery, delivering a clinical medical update. Nothing more. I looked directly at Connor. "The surgery is complete," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the raw emotion they desperately wanted to see from me. Chloe suffered a shattered right femur, 2 broken ribs, and a severely punctured lung. She experienced significant internal bleeding that complicated the procedure. However, I was able to successfully repair the lung tissue, stabilize the rib cage, and stop the hemorrhaging. Her vitals are currently stable, and she is being moved to the surgical intensive care unit for close observation. She is going to survive the night. I paused and waited for the collective sigh of relief. I waited for the moment where normal human beings would collapse into each other, shedding tears of gratitude that their loved one had been pulled back from the absolute brink of death. But this was not a normal family. This was a family built entirely on a foundation of toxic pride, a desperate need to always be right, and a deep-seated colorism that blinded them to reality. My mother slowly stood up from the leather sofa. Her eyes darted from the pristine white fabric of my doctor coat to the embroidered letters spelling out my name and official medical title. She did not say thank you. She did not ask if Chloe was in severe pain or when they could see her. Instead, her face hardened into a familiar mask of deep, ugly resentment. She took 3 quick, aggressive steps toward me. Before I could even register the sudden movement, her hand swung through the air. The sharp cracking sound of her palm striking my left cheek echoed violently in the small, soundproof room. The physical force of the unexpected slap snapped my head to the side. A stinging, intense heat instantly bloomed across my dark skin. My father did not gasp in shock. Connor did not flinch or try to hold her back. They simply watched me as if I had fully deserved the physical assault. "You did this on purpose," Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with venom and an insane, twisted logic. "You botched her surgery to get revenge, did you not? You knew she was vulnerable and helpless on that operating table, and you purposely messed up her leg so she would never walk right again. You have always been jealous of her beauty and her success. You are a disgusting monster, Simone. You always have been." I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not raise my hand to touch my burning cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. 2 years ago, a slap like that from my own mother would have shattered my heart and sent me spiraling into an endless apology I did not owe. But the woman standing in front of her now was not the frightened, exhausted medical student she had thrown out into the freezing Atlanta snow. I was a woman who had rebuilt herself from absolutely nothing, using nothing but my own brilliance and sheer willpower. I looked down at my mother, observing her face twisted in ugly, baseless hatred, and I felt nothing but absolute pity. "You are completely delusional, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet and commanding register. "I just spent 4 agonizing hours meticulously picking shattered bone fragments out of your daughter's lung. I saved her miserable life while you sat in here worrying about how this tragedy would look to your wealthy country club friends." Connor shoved his way past my father, jabbing his index finger mere inches from my face. "Do not you dare speak to her like that, you ungrateful brat!" he shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. Saliva flew from his mouth, landing on the lapel of my clean white coat. He aggressively pulled his latest model smartphone from his tailored suit pocket and waved it in the air like a weapon. "I am calling my legal team right now. We are suing you, and we are suing this entire garbage public hospital. You are a pathetic medical school dropout who stole your family's money for drugs. You probably forged that badge you are wearing to sneak in here. I am going to have you stripped of whatever fake credentials you bought, and I will personally see to it that you are thrown in federal prison for medical malpractice and aggravated assault." He began violently dialing a number, pacing the small room again. "I am going to buy this pathetic hospital and bulldoze it to the ground, just to ensure you never work in this city again." He ranted, his white privilege radiating from every single word. "You messed with the wrong family, Simone. You are absolutely finished. I am going to ruin your entire pathetic existence." I did not even blink at his pathetic display of wealthy entitlement. I simply stood my ground, my hand gripping the manila folder that held the true dark secrets of his perfect wife. I knew that the moment I opened that folder, his entire arrogant world would collapse. But I did not even need to say a word to shut him up. Before Connor could press the final call button, the heavy door to the consultation room swung open with a forceful whoosh. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Richard Harrison, the chief medical officer and the executive director of Atlanta Memorial Hospital. He was a towering, imposing figure with silver hair and an absolute no-nonsense demeanor that commanded instant respect from everyone who crossed his path. He had been my closest mentor during my surgical residency, and he knew every single agonizing detail about the hell my family had put me through. Dr. Harrison stepped fully into the room, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto the angry red handprint blooming brightly across my left cheek. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees instantly. He turned his piercing gaze directly onto my mother. His voice was dangerously low and carried the heavy, crushing weight of absolute institutional authority. "I saw exactly what you just did through the glass," he said, pointing a firm, unwavering finger at Brenda. "You just physically assaulted Dr. Simone Hayes. She is not a dropout. She is the top orthopedic trauma surgeon on the entire East Coast, and she is the esteemed head of the emergency department at this institution." Connor stopped his dialing mid-keystroke, his thumb hovering frozen over the glowing screen. My father, Calvin, physically took a step backward, his mouth falling slightly open in complete shock. Dr. Harrison stepped closer to my mother, forcing her to retreat awkwardly until the back of her legs hit the edge of the leather sofa. Dr. Hayes did not forge her credentials. He continued, his voice booming and echoing in the silent room. She graduated at the absolute top of her class from one of the most prestigious medical programs in the nation. She runs the most successful trauma bay in the state of Georgia. She just spent 4 exhausting hours saving your daughter's life using complex surgical techniques that only a handful of physicians in this entire country can safely perform. And instead of getting down on your knees and thanking God that she happened to be on shift tonight to save your child, you struck her across the face. Dr. Harrison pulled his heavy hospital security radio from his belt, holding it up for them to see. If anyone in this room speaks one more disrespectful word to my chief of trauma, or makes one more empty, pathetic threat about a malpractice lawsuit, I will personally have the Atlanta Police Department drag you all out of this building in handcuffs for assaulting a frontline healthcare worker. He slowly turned his glaring eyes toward Connor. And I assure you, sir, no amount of your loud finance money will save you from a felony assault charge in this county. Do I make myself absolutely clear? The silence that quickly swallowed the room was absolute and incredibly satisfying. The arrogant, fiery entitlement in Connor's eyes was completely extinguished, replaced by the sudden, cold, terrifying realization of reality. My mother sank down heavily onto the sofa, her manicured hands trembling violently in her lap. My father stared blankly at the floor, entirely unable to lift his head to meet my eyes. They had confidently walked into this hospital expecting to bully and manipulate the dark-skinned black sheep of the family just like they always did. Instead, they had just been publicly humiliated, threatened with jail time, and put firmly in their place by one of the most powerful medical figures in the city. I looked at the 3 of them, shattered, speechless, and utterly powerless in my domain. I calmly adjusted the collar of my white coat, shifted the heavy manila folder to my other hand, and prepared to drop the real bomb that would completely obliterate their false reality forever. Dr. Harrison gave my family one final warning glare before turning on his heel and walking out of the consultation room. The heavy door closed behind him, leaving a thick, suffocating silence in its wake. My mother was still frozen on the edge of the sofa, holding her cheek in absolute disbelief. My father was staring blankly at the floor. Connor was visibly shaking, but whether it was from anger or sudden terrifying reality, I did not care. I looked at the 3 of them and felt a profound sense of closure. The old Simone, the terrified medical student who desperately craved their validation, would have apologized to keep the peace. But the woman standing in front of them now felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. "You have your medical update," I said, my voice completely flat and professional. "Chloe is being transferred to the surgical intensive care unit. Because of the severity of her injuries and the chemical substances in her system, she will need to be monitored around the clock. You need to go to the main billing and admissions desk at the end of this hallway to complete her intake paperwork and establish her insurance coverage. Do not cause a scene out there." I turned and walked out of the room, not waiting for them to follow. I headed over to the main nurse's station to update Chloe's digital medical chart, but I deliberately kept my eyes fixed on the admissions desk a few yards away. I wanted to watch this play out. A few moments later, my parents and Connor slowly emerged from the consultation room. Connor was already aggressively straightening his expensive suit jacket, desperately trying to piece together his shattered ego. He led the way to the admissions desk, walking with that familiar, arrogant swagger that always made my stomach turn. The woman working the billing desk was Mrs. Jenkins, a seasoned hospital administrator who had seen every type of wealthy entitlement imaginable over her 30-year career. Connor leaned heavily against the high counter, completely invading her personal space. He did not say please or thank you. "I need my wife moved out of the general intensive care unit immediately," he demanded loudly enough for half the emergency floor to hear. "I am not having her recover in a room surrounded by a bunch of standard public hospital patients. She needs privacy. I want her placed in your absolute best private executive suite right now." Mrs. Jenkins did not even blink at his tone. She calmly adjusted her glasses and typed his request into her computer system. "Sir, our executive recovery suites are generally reserved for private pay VIP patients." She explained, her voice perfectly polite but firm. "Your current insurance plan strictly covers standard intensive care accommodations. If you want her moved to the luxury suite, it requires an out-of-pocket deposit of $5,000 per night payable immediately upon intake." Connor let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, throwing his head back. He looked over his shoulder at my father and shook his head as if the hospital staff were completely beneath him. "5,000 a night is absolute pocket change for me," he bragged, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a heavy black metal platinum credit card and slapped it down onto the counter with a loud thud. "Just charge it for the entire week right now, and make sure someone sends up some decent coffee to that room." Mrs. Jenkins picked up the heavy card without a word and swiped it through the credit terminal. The machine processed for a few seconds, clicking quietly. Then a sharp, high-pitched beep echoed across the quiet desk. The digital screen on the terminal flashed bright red. "Declined." Mrs. Jenkins handed the heavy metal card back across the counter. "I am sorry, sir, but this card has been declined," she said calmly. Connor snatched the card back, his face instantly flushing a dark, angry shade of crimson. "That is completely impossible," he snapped, raising his voice. "That is a corporate platinum account with absolutely no preset spending limit. Your cheap public hospital machine is obviously broken. Run it again." Mrs. Jenkins patiently took the card from his trembling hand and swiped it a second time. The machine processed. Beep. The red screen flashed again. "Declined." Connor's arrogant posture began to violently crumble right before my eyes. The loud, confident finance bro was suddenly replaced by a panicked man darting his eyes around the room. He aggressively opened his designer leather wallet again and pulled out a different card, this one a gold premium credit card. "Try this one," he ordered, his voice losing its confident edge. He was starting to sweat. He took the machine and swiped the card himself. Beep. Declined. He cursed loudly under his breath and pulled out a third card, a standard bank debit card. He shoved it into the chip reader, his hands visibly shaking now. He punched in his PIN number with aggressive, forceful taps. The machine thought for a moment. Beep. Declined. I stood silently near the nurse's station, watching the entire pathetic display unfold with a cold, detached satisfaction. For 2 whole years, Connor had paraded around our family gatherings, acting like a Wall Street billionaire. He constantly made passive-aggressive comments about my public service salary and openly mocked the neighborhood where Julian and I bought our first home. He always used his perceived immense wealth as a protective shield for his blatant racism and his glaring mediocrity. He convinced my parents that he was the ultimate prize for their golden, lighter-skinned daughter. But right here under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the hospital, his carefully constructed facade was dissolving into thin air. He was a complete fraud. He had absolutely nothing. My father Calvin noticed the growing scene and quickly stepped forward. He put a reassuring, fatherly hand on Connor's shoulder, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch stepping in to save the day. "It is perfectly all right, son," Calvin said, using his deep, authoritative church voice. "The bank probably flagged your accounts for fraud because of the sudden late-night hospital charges out of nowhere. It happens to high-net-worth individuals like us all the time. Step aside and let me handle this." Calvin opened his wallet and pulled out his own premium credit card, the exact one attached to the massive family trust fund he had bragged about my entire life. The same account he had accused me of stealing from to fund a fake drug habit. He handed it to Mrs. Jenkins with a smug, confident smile, aiming to restore the family honor. "Go ahead and put the entire week on this card," he instructed her proudly. "We take care of our own." Mrs. Jenkins took the card and ran it through the terminal. The machine processed for a long, agonizing moment. The silence at the desk was deafening. Then the terminal let out an obnoxiously loud and sharp error beep. It was a different sound this time, longer and more final. Mrs. Jenkins looked at the computer screen and then looked up at my father with a deeply concerned expression. "I am very sorry, sir," she said, pushing the premium card back across the counter. "But the banking system is showing that this account is completely frozen. You need to contact your financial institution immediately." Calvin's smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished, and all the color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking completely hollow. Calvin's proud, arrogant face vanished instantly, and all the color violently drained from his skin, leaving him looking completely hollow. Frozen, he stammered, repeating Mrs. Jenkins' words as if she had just spoken a foreign language. "You must be mistaken. That is a massive trust fund account. It never gets frozen. Run the card again right now." Mrs. Jenkins pushed the card back toward him, across the marble counter. "I cannot run it again, sir," she replied calmly. "The banking system has locked this card completely. You will have to call their fraud department yourself." Before my father could utter another threat or excuse, the double doors of the intensive care unit suddenly flew open. One of my surgical nurses rushed out into the hallway, her eyes scanning frantically until they locked onto me. "Dr. Hayes," she called out, her voice laced with extreme urgency. "The patient just lost the pulse in her right leg. We cannot find a heartbeat below her knee." I instantly dropped all the petty satisfaction and mockery in my head and snapped right back into being a trauma surgeon. I shoved past my parents and Connor, sprinting straight into the intensive care unit. Chloe was lying in her bed, the heart monitor blaring a rapid, sharp warning tone. I threw back the thin hospital blanket and examined her right leg. The skin was incredibly pale and ice cold to the touch. Her toes were already beginning to turn a dark mottled purple. The blood flow had been completely cut off. "Prep operating room 2 immediately," I ordered my team. "Get her on the vascular ultrasound right now. We have a massive blood clot or a crushed arterial segment blocking the blood supply. If we do not restore the circulation in the next 45 minutes, she is going to lose her entire leg from the knee down." I spun around and marched right back out into the hallway where my family was standing huddled together, looking completely terrified. "Chloe's situation just took a massive turn for the worse," I announced flatly, giving them absolutely no time to process the shock. "Her femoral artery is severely compromised. She needs an emergency vascular bypass surgery right this second. It is a highly complex microsurgical procedure." My mother started sobbing hysterically, grabbing my father's arm. "Then just do it," she screamed at me. "Save her leg, Simone." I looked directly at Connor, who had taken a physical step backward, his face completely white. "I am perfectly capable of doing the surgery," I told him. "But this is not a standard trauma repair. This is a specialized procedure that requires highly expensive artificial vascular grafts. The cost for this surgery is $80,000. Mrs. Jenkins just ran the health insurance information you provided. You let Chloe's policy lapse 3 months ago for non-payment. You have zero coverage. I need your signature on the surgical consent form, and you have to prove you can pay for the artificial grafts right now, otherwise the hospital pharmacy will not release the materials." Connor stared at me as if I had just asked him to chop off his own arm. $80,000, he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You are completely insane. I do not have $80,000. My credit cards are not working. My insurance is gone. I cannot pay that. Cannot pay." "Then figure it out," I fired back coldly. "Call your wealthy family. Call your corporate finance partners. Do whatever you have to do. But the clock is ticking. In 45 minutes, the tissue in her leg will begin to permanently die. And when that happens, I will not be doing a bypass. I will be amputating her right leg." The entire hallway seemed to hold its breath. My mother let out a blood-curdling shriek and covered her mouth with both hands. My father lunged forward, grabbing Connor by the lapels of his expensive designer jacket. "Call your bank," Calvin growled, spitting the words into his son-in-law's face. "Call your parents. Do whatever you have to do to save my daughter. You are a senior finance executive. You always brag about your massive bonuses. Get the money right now. Connor violently shoved my father off him, breaking his grip. His face twisted into an incredibly ugly and cowardly expression. There are no bonuses, he shouted, waving his hands frantically. That finance firm fired me 6 months ago. I do not have any money. We have been surviving on maxed out credit cards and the cash I pulled from your retirement fund. I am completely broke. The dark, ugly truth was finally exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway. The arrogant white man who always acted so superior, who constantly mocked my public hospital job and insulted my family heritage, was actually a pathetic, broke fraud. He had absolutely nothing but tailored suits and arrogant lies. He had weaponized my parents' obsession with status and their internalized racism to worm his way into this family and drain every last cent from their accounts. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. Connor turned back to face me and his eyes grew incredibly cold and ruthless. He straightened his suit collar, ran a hand through his messy hair, and took a deep breath. He looked at me, and then he looked toward the doors of Chloe's room. I am not signing that consent form, he said, his voice sickeningly clear and detached. I am not taking on an $80,000 mountain of medical debt for a leg. If she loses it, then it is her own stupid fault for driving her car while completely wasted. Just amputate the leg. I do not care. I am not paying a single dime for this surgery. My mother stumbled backward as if she had just been shot in the chest. She collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor as heavy broken sobs tore through her chest. She could not fathom that the perfect wealthy son-in-law she worshipped was casually throwing her daughter away like garbage to save himself from debt. My father turned bright red with absolute fury. He lunged at Connor, throwing a wild punch aimed right at his face. Connor easily dodged it, grabbed my father by the shoulders, and forcefully shoved the older man down onto the hard linoleum floor. Their picture-perfect family was physically tearing each other apart, shredding the fake righteous facade they had maintained for decades. I remembered Christmas Eve. I remembered Connor standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, a smug, mocking smile playing on his lips as I shivered in the freezing snow. He had told my parents that people like me only bring disgrace to a family. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a hospital, abandoning his own mutilated wife and revealing himself as a ruthless gold digger. His entire fake career, his luxury vacations, his sports cars, all of it was built on lies and stolen money. My father scrambled up from the floor, clutching his chest and breathing heavily. He looked at Connor with pure hatred, but also with a crushing sense of utter helplessness. He had handed over his entire life savings to this man, believing a white financial expert would make him rich. He had blindly trusted his son-in-law and turned his back on his own flesh and blood daughter. Now, standing on the precipice of Chloe losing her leg, he finally realized who the real parasite in the family was. I turned my attention to Mrs. Jenkins, the veteran billing administrator, who had maintained her perfect professional composure through the entire ordeal. She had witnessed countless family tragedies at this desk, but I could tell this was the first time she had ever seen a husband so callously refuse to save his own wife's limb. She handed me the surgical consent clipboard, her eyes filled with disgust as she looked at Connor. "Dr. Hayes," she said softly, "the patient is completely uninsured, and the next of kin is officially refusing financial responsibility and withholding medical consent. The hospital cannot authorize the release of the specialized bypass equipment without guaranteed funding. What do we do now?" I set my coffee cup down on the marble counter, took the pen from her hand, and stared blankly at the wall. According to medical law, I had the ultimate executive authority to bypass the husband and perform emergency life-saving measures. I could easily pay the $80,000 myself by swiping my own personal credit card. That amount of money was literally a fraction of the monthly passive income Julian and I generated from our real estate portfolio. I could save her leg with a single signature, but I was not going to make it that easy for them. I wanted my family to feel the absolute rock bottom, agonizing despair that they had forced me to endure 2 years ago. I wanted them to open their eyes and fully realize that the physical safety of their golden child now rested entirely in the hands of the dark-skinned daughter they had violently thrown away. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched their complete emotional collapse with quiet, steady eyes. I felt no pity. I only felt that justice was finally being served in the most brutal way imaginable. I pulled my personal black premium credit card from my pocket and slapped it down onto the marble counter right next to Connor's rejected plastic. "Charge the $80,000 to my account," I told Mrs. Jenkins, my voice loud and unwavering. My father and Connor both snapped their heads toward me, staring in absolute stunned silence. They could not comprehend how the daughter they had thrown out into the freezing snow 2 years ago was now casually funding a massive medical procedure out of her own pocket. I did not give them a single glance or a moment to ask questions. I turned around and marched straight back to the operating room. I scrubbed back in and performed the vascular bypass with cold mechanical precision. I grafted the artificial artery, I carefully restored the blood flow, and I saved the golden child's leg. I did not do it out of lingering sisterly love or a desperate desire for my family's approval. I did it because I refused to let my flawless surgical record be tarnished by Connor's pathetic financial failures. And more importantly, I wanted Chloe completely physically whole so she could fully feel the agonizing weight of the legal and financial ruin that was rapidly hurtling toward her. 4 hours later, the heavy surgical sedatives finally began to wear off. The harsh afternoon sunlight was filtering through the sterile blinds of the surgical intensive care unit. I stood quietly in the corner of Chloe's private recovery room, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I was holding her updated medical chart and the undeniable toxicology report. My parents and Connor had been allowed into the room a few minutes prior. Connor was standing awkwardly by the window, keeping his distance from the bed. He was still trying to maintain his arrogant posture, but his eyes were darting around the room nervously, completely terrified that someone was going to ask him for money again. My mother Brenda was hovering directly over the hospital bed, clutching Chloe's uninjured hand. My father Calvin stood right behind her, looking exhausted and utterly defeated. Chloe let out a low, agonizing groan as her eyes slowly fluttered open. She blinked against the bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room. Her face was heavily bruised and bandaged, and her right leg was elevated and immobilized in a heavy brace. "Oh, my sweet, beautiful baby girl," Brenda cooed, dramatically stroking Chloe's hair. "You are awake. You are going to be perfectly fine. Mommy is right here." Most normal people waking up in an intensive care unit hooked up to a dozen loud beeping machines would immediately ask if they were going to survive or if anyone else was hurt in the crash. But Chloe was not a normal person. She was a textbook narcissist who had spent her entire 32 years of life expertly dodging accountability. Even through the heavy haze of anesthesia, her toxic survival instincts immediately kicked in. She did not ask about her injuries. She immediately began to craft her false narrative. "Mom, my leg hurts so much," she whined, her voice raspy and weak. "It was not my fault, Mom. I swear it was not my fault." "Of course it was not your fault, darling," Brenda replied, instantly validating the lie without even knowing what the lie was. "You are a perfect driver. What happened out there?" Chloe let out a dramatic sob, squeezing her eyes shut to force out a few tears. "I had the green light," she lied, her voice trembling with fake trauma. "I was driving perfectly fine, and then this crazy black woman in a beat-up old Honda just swerved right into my lane out of nowhere. She completely cut me off. She was driving like a complete maniac. She hit me on purpose, Mom. She tried to kill me." I stood in the corner of the room and actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her lies was staggering. The police report, which I had already reviewed with the arriving officers, stated clearly that Chloe had been driving 80 miles per hour in a 40 zone. She had blown straight through a solid red light and T-boned a parked delivery truck. There was no black woman in a Honda. There was no swerving. But Chloe's immediate instinct was to weaponize her lighter skin and her wealthy status. She defaulted to blaming an imaginary darker-skinned woman, knowing exactly how to play on my parents' deeply internalized colorism. She knew Brenda would instantly believe a story about a reckless, dark-skinned woman ruining her perfect daughter's life. It was the exact same racial and emotional manipulation she had used 2 years ago when she convinced them I was a drug addict. "That is absolutely horrible!" Brenda gasped, her eyes widening with outrage. "I knew it! I knew someone else did this to you. We are going to find that woman, and we are going to sue her for every single penny she has. Connor, call the police right now and tell them it was a hit and run." Connor shifted uncomfortably by the window, completely avoiding eye contact with everyone. He knew they did not have the money to hire a lawyer, let alone track down a phantom driver. Chloe slowly turned her head on the thin hospital pillow, scanning the room for her husband. But as her gaze moved past the heavy medical equipment, her eyes suddenly locked onto me, standing quietly in the shadows of the corner. The effect was absolutely instantaneous. The heart monitor connected to her chest immediately began to spike loudly. The steady, rhythmic beeps turned into a rapid, frantic alarm. Chloe's eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. She practically scrambled backward against the elevated mattress, ignoring the agonizing pain in her freshly operated leg. "What is she doing here?" Chloe shrieked, pointing a trembling, bandaged finger directly at my face. "Get her out! Get her out right now!" I stepped slowly out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the room. I was wearing my crisp, white doctor coat, my hospital badge gleaming under the fluorescent bulbs. "Hello, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly calm and medically detached. "I am Dr. Hayes. I am the lead trauma surgeon who just spent 4 hours putting your shattered body back together." Chloe began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved violently, and she clawed frantically at her mother's arm. "Mom, she is lying!" Chloe screamed, pure panic radiating from every syllable. "She is not a real doctor. She is a drug addict. She dropped out of school. She hates me, Mom. She is going to kill me. She is going to put poison in my IV bag to get revenge. You have to get her away from me before she murders me." The absolute absurdity of the accusation echoed off the sterile walls. I had just paid $80,000 out of my own pocket to save her leg from amputation, and she was screaming that I was an assassin creeping into her room to poison her intravenous fluids. But the truly sickening part was not Chloe's delusion. It was my mother's reaction. Brenda did not pause to look at the medical equipment keeping her daughter alive. She did not look at the expensive surgical work holding Chloe's leg together. She heard her lighter-skinned golden child cry out, and her toxic maternal instincts blinded her to all logic and reality. Brenda spun around and threw herself protectively over Chloe's body, shielding her from me. She glared at me with an intense burning hatred that made my stomach turn cold. "You heard her?" Brenda snarled, her voice dripping with venom. "Get out of this room right now, Simone. I do not care what your fake little badge says. You are upsetting my daughter. You are probably exactly the kind of reckless person who ran her off the road today. Leave before she has a heart attack." I stood at the foot of the hospital bed looking at the pathetic display in front of me. A lying, drug-addicted sister projecting her crimes onto an imaginary woman. A cowardly, broke husband hiding by the window. And a deeply prejudiced mother aggressively protecting the very person who had secretly destroyed their family finances. They were so deeply entrenched in their own toxic delusions that they could not see the massive legal guillotine hanging directly over their heads. I did not argue. I did not defend my medical credentials. I simply tapped my pen against the plastic clipboard holding her toxicology report and smiled a cold, terrifying smile. "I will gladly step outside," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "But you might want to save your energy, Brenda. Because my medical update is not the only thing arriving in this room today." Right on cue, the heavy doors to the intensive care unit slid open, and the storm I had been waiting for finally arrived. I stepped out of the intensive care unit, letting the heavy glass doors slide shut behind me. I did not even make it 10 feet down the hospital corridor before I heard the frantic clicking of my mother's heels on the linoleum floor. My parents were following hot on my trail just as I knew they would. Connor had stayed behind in the room hiding in the corner because he was far too much of a coward to face the massive financial reality of the situation he had created. Simone. Wait a minute, my father hissed, grabbing my elbow tightly. I stopped walking and slowly turned my head to look at his hand gripping the sleeve of my white doctor coat. I did not say a word. I simply gave him a look so incredibly cold and authoritative that he immediately let go, taking a nervous step backward. We were standing in a quiet, secluded alcove near the surgical waiting area. The late afternoon sun was casting long, dark shadows across the hallway, giving the space an eerie, heavy atmosphere. My mother crossed her arms over her chest, her face hardened into a familiar mask of demanding entitlement. "We need to talk about the hospital bill," she said, dropping all pretenses of maternal warmth. "Mrs. Jenkins at the billing desk just gave us the preliminary estimate for the trauma care, the intensive care suite, and that highly specialized vascular bypass you just performed. The total is projected to be over $400,000 by the end of the week." My father stepped closer, looking nervously up and down the hallway to ensure no hospital staff members were listening to our conversation. "Connor is completely useless," he muttered, his voice dripping with sudden resentment for the son-in-law he had worshipped just an hour ago. "And my trust accounts are temporarily frozen due to some ridiculous banking error. We cannot pay this bill." "But you are the head of this department, Simone. You have top-level administrative clearance and executive override codes." I stared at him, my face completely unreadable. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Calvin?" "We need you to go into the hospital billing system and wipe Chloe's debt clean." My mother interrupted, her tone demanding and sharp. "You can classify it as charity care or write it off as an unavoidable hospital expense. Say the equipment was faulty or that she qualifies for a low-income grant now that Connor is unemployed. We do not care how you do it. You just need to make that $400,000 bill disappear today." I actually let out a dry, hollow laugh. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their demand was breathtaking. "You want me to commit massive hospital financial fraud?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You want me to risk my medical license, my career, and my freedom to erase the debts of the sister who lied to destroy my life? The sister who is currently lying in that room trying to blame a completely innocent black woman for a car crash she caused while driving under the influence." Brenda took a step forward, invading my personal space. Her eyes narrowed into vicious, venomous slits. "You owe us," she snarled, jabbing her manicured finger at my chest. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. And if you do not do this one simple thing for your family, we will have absolutely no choice but to go directly to the hospital board of directors." I tilted my head, watching her dig her own grave deeper with every single word. "Is that so? And what exactly will you tell them, Brenda?" "We will tell them all about your little drug problem 2 years ago," my father chimed in, a cruel, smug smile spreading across his face. "We will tell the hospital administrators and the local media how you stole $150,000 from your own father to buy cocaine. We will tell them you are an unstable addict who dropped out of medical school and somehow conned your way into this prestigious position." My mother nodded eagerly, her eyes gleaming with malice. "A major public hospital relies heavily on its pristine reputation, Simone. If wealthy donors and the medical board find out the chief of trauma is a former drug addict who steals from her own family, they will strip your medical license before the week is even over. You will be publicly disgraced. You will lose this fancy job, you will lose your income, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. So you are going to walk over to that computer terminal right now, and you are going to erase your sister's medical debt." They stood there looking at me with absolute triumph. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they still held the power of that terrible lie from 2 years ago. They honestly believed I was still the terrified, broken medical student, shivering in the freezing Atlanta snow, desperate for their love, and terrified of their judgment. They were willing to completely destroy my life all over again, without a single second of hesitation, just to shield their lighter-skinned golden child from the consequences of her own reckless actions. I did not panic. I did not cry. I did not beg them to keep quiet. I just looked at the two people who brought me into this world and marveled at the absolute depths of their moral depravity. The colorism, the narcissism, the sheer evil required to blackmail your own daughter in a hospital hallway, it was staggering. I took a deep breath and opened my mouth to tell them exactly what I thought of their pathetic little threat. But I did not have to say a single word. A deep, resonant voice echoed from the hallway, cutting through the thick, toxic tension in the alcove like a freshly sharpened surgical scalpel. I did not think the felony crime of extortion would be this incredibly easy to record. My parents violently spun around, gasping in shock. Standing at the edge of the alcove, looking like an absolute apex predator stepping into the light, was my husband, Julian. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that radiated wealth and uncompromising power. He held a sleek leather briefcase in his left hand. In his right hand, he held his smartphone elevated perfectly at chest level. The screen of the phone was brightly lit, displaying an active voice recording application. The digital timer was ticking upward, capturing every single vile word of their blackmail attempt in crystal-clear high-definition audio. Julian slowly lowered his smartphone, his thumb tapping the screen to finalize and save the audio file. The soft digital chime of the file saving echoed loudly in the dead silence of the alcove. He slid the phone into the inner pocket of his suit jacket with a calm, deliberate motion. My mother's mouth was hanging wide open. She looked from Julian to me, and then back to Julian, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. 2 years ago, she had stood in our living room and cruelly told me that my dark skin and natural hair would guarantee that no respectable, successful man would ever want to marry me. She told me I would end up completely alone and destitute. Yet here was Julian, a dark-skinned black man who commanded the room completely effortlessly. He did not need to shout or throw a tantrum like Connor did. His power was quiet, absolute, and terrifying. He walked over to where I stood and placed a gentle, protective hand on the small of my back. The contrast between my husband and my sister's husband could not have been more glaring. Connor was a fake, a coward hiding in a hospital room while his wife suffered. Julian was a shield, a man who walked directly into the fire to stand by my side. "Who are you?" Calvin demanded, trying to puff out his chest to regain some semblance of his usual patriarchal authority, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying his underlying panic. Julian smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the cold, calculating smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "I am Julian Hayes," he said, his voice deep, smooth, and unwavering. "I am a senior partner at Vanguard Legal Group, specializing in white-collar crime, corporate fraud, and high-stakes litigation. I also happen to be Dr. Simone Hayes, incredibly proud husband." The word husband hit them both like a physical blow. Brenda physically recoiled, bumping into the wall behind her. They had missed my wedding because they had thrown me away. They assumed I was living in a cheap apartment somewhere, struggling to survive. The sudden realization that I was not only the head of a major hospital department, but also married to a legal powerhouse completely shattered their false narrative. Julian set his expensive leather briefcase down on a small wooden table in the alcove. The heavy gold clasps clicked open loudly, sounding like the cocking of a loaded weapon. Under the Georgia Criminal Code Title 16, Chapter 8, Article 2, Julian began speaking with the flawless, rhythmic cadence of a seasoned trial lawyer addressing a jury. A person commits the offense of theft by extortion when he or she unlawfully obtains property of or from another person by threatening to disseminate any information tending to subject any person to hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or by threatening to impair his or her credit or business repute. Calvin swallowed hard, the movement highly visible in his throat. He looked around the hallway nervously, realizing how incredibly exposed they were. "What the two of you just did," Julian continued, pulling a sleek digital tablet from his briefcase, "was threaten to ruin my wife's pristine medical career with fabricated stories of drug addiction unless she committed major financial fraud to erase a $400,000 hospital bill. That is a textbook felony. It carries a minimum sentence of 1 to 10 years in a state penitentiary." Brenda started waving her hands frantically, her manicured nails trembling in the air. "Now hold on just a minute," she stammered, her voice shrill and desperate. "You cannot record us without our permission. That is completely illegal. This is a private conversation between a family. You cannot use that recording anywhere." Julian let out a dry, amused chuckle that made my parents flinch. Actually, Brenda, Georgia is a one-party consent state. As long as one person involved in the conversation consents to the recording, it is completely legal and entirely admissible in a court of law. Since I walked up behind you and verbally engaged before you made your final threat, I legally became a party to the conversation. I consented, which means I now have a pristine, high-definition digital confession of you attempting to extort a senior hospital executive. The color completely drained from Calvin's face. He suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. The arrogant church elder who loved to sit in the front pew and pass judgment on everyone else in the community was now sweating profusely under the clinical lighting of the hospital corridor. His perfectly pressed suit suddenly looked entirely too big for him. "Listen here, son," Calvin stammered, taking a cautious step forward and raising his hands in a weak, placating gesture. "You have this all wrong. We were just upset. Emotions are running incredibly high right now. Her sister is in the intensive care unit, heavily medicated. We were just having a heated family disagreement. Nobody is extorting anybody. We just want what is best for the family." Julian's smile vanished instantly. His eyes turned as cold and hard as obsidian. "Do not ever call me son," he warned, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "You lost the right to use any familial titles the night you threw my wife out into a freezing blizzard. And the courts do not care about your high emotions, Calvin. They care about hard evidence. I have the audio. I have the hospital security cameras showing you cornering her aggressively in this hallway. If you ever breathe a single negative word about my wife to the hospital board, the media, or anyone else in this city, I will personally hand this recording over to the district attorney, and I will make sure the prosecutor seeks the maximum sentence." My parents were completely paralyzed. They were lifetime bullies who had relied on emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, and religious hypocrisy to control everyone around them. But emotional manipulation absolutely does not work on a corporate lawyer holding undeniable physical evidence. They had brought their toxic family dynamics to a legal gunfight, and they were completely and utterly outmatched. They had no leverage left. "We just want to help Chloe," Brenda whispered, her voice finally breaking. The fake dramatic tears were completely gone, replaced by genuine terror. "We do not have the money, Simone. Connor is broke. We are going to lose our house and our country club memberships if we have to pay this hospital bill. Please, you have to understand our position." Julian snapped his briefcase shut with a loud final click echoing down the corridor. "Your financial mismanagement is not my wife's problem," he stated plainly. "You chose to back a fraudulent, entitled man who drained your accounts, and you chose to protect a daughter who lied to cover her own tracks. Those were your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences." I watched my husband absolutely dismantle my abusers with nothing but logic and the law, and I felt a massive wave of profound vindication wash over me. For my entire life, my parents had acted as the ultimate judge and jury, constantly condemning me for simply existing in my own dark skin. They had made me feel small, ugly, and unworthy of basic respect. Now, the absolute power had finally been transferred. The gavel was firmly in our hands. But as satisfying as it was to watch them squirm under the threat of extortion charges, I knew the real destruction was still waiting inside Julian's briefcase. Julian looked at me, his eyes softening for a brief second to check if I was okay before his gaze hardened again toward my parents. And speaking of financial mismanagement, Julian said, stepping closer to Calvin and Brenda, we are not even close to being finished here today. You might want to sit down, Calvin, because the truth about why your bank accounts are frozen is going to hurt a lot more than a hospital bill. Julian looked directly at Calvin, his cold smile completely fading away. He turned back to the small wooden table in the alcove where his expensive leather briefcase rested. The sharp metallic clicks of the latch's opening echoed in the quiet hospital corridor, sounding exactly like the cocking of a loaded weapon. Brenda swallowed hard, nervously wringing her manicured hands together, while Calvin just stood there completely frozen, watching the son-in-law he had never bothered to acknowledge. Julian carefully pulled out a thick, heavily bound stack of documents embossed with the official Vanguard Legal Group logo. He held the heavy file in his hands, flipping open the thick cover with the terrifying calm of a top-tier corporate litigator preparing to completely dismantle a hostile witness. Calvin Julian began, his voice deep and carrying the heavy weight of absolute, undeniable truth. When Simone first told me the story of why she was violently banished from her own family on Christmas Eve 2 years ago, I immediately felt that something was fundamentally illogical. An honors medical student working 36-hour shifts at a hospital does not suddenly steal $150,000 to buy cocaine without exhibiting a single physical or behavioral sign of severe drug addiction. As an attorney who specializes in tracking illicit corporate funds, my professional instinct told me one very simple fact. The money trail absolutely never lies. It always leaves a permanent digital footprint. Julian took a step forward and forcefully pressed the thick folder directly into Calvin's chest, forcing the older man to raise his hands and take it. Calvin looked down at the first page. His face immediately lost whatever little color it had left when he recognized the official bank letterhead. It was the detailed transaction history of his prized family trust account, the exact fund he had spent decades bragging about to his church congregation. That is the complete, unredacted transaction history of your trust fund from exactly 2 years ago, Julian explained, enunciating every single word with sharp, deliberate precision. There were absolutely no cash withdrawals made under Simone's name. There were no shady transfers to known narcotics dealers. Every single penny of that $150,000 was wired directly into a private offshore banking account exclusively controlled by your trusted financial advisor and beloved son-in-law Connor. Brenda gasped loudly, stepping closer to her husband to peer over his shoulder at the bold black numbers printed on the page. That is impossible, she stammered, shaking her head in aggressive denial. Connor told us that Simone hacked into the banking portal and forged the transfer authorization. He said he tried to stop the wire, but he was too late. I stood leaning against the cool hospital wall and actually let out a dry, bitter laugh. The absolute blind worship they had for that mediocre white man had completely short-circuited their basic critical thinking skills. They were so deeply poisoned by their own internalized racism and colorism that they would rather believe their hard-working black daughter was a criminal mastermind hacker than even slightly suspect their shiny, wealthy white son-in-law of stealing from them. Julian completely ignored Brenda's pathetic attempt at denial. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. This one contained high-definition color photographs and detailed credit card statements. He held the photos up right in front of their faces so they could not look away from the ugly truth. This is the spending history attached to that exact offshore account. Julian continued, pressing the legal knife even deeper. Exactly 3 days after you threw your biological daughter out into a freezing winter storm, Connor and Chloe flew first class to Dubai. They stayed at a luxury resort that costs $5,000 a single night. The remaining bulk of your stolen retirement money was used to make a massive down payment on a brand new luxury Porsche sports car, the exact same vehicle that your golden child just drunkenly wrapped around a delivery truck 2 hours ago. Calvin's hands began to shake violently. The thick stack of financial papers rustled loudly in the silent hallway. The evidence was overwhelmingly clear and meticulously documented. The luxury shopping sprees, the expensive dinners at exclusive restaurants halfway across the world, all of it was legally registered in the names of his perfect, lighter-skinned daughter and the son-in-law he had practically worshipped. His entire life savings had been brazenly liquidated to fund the delusional, luxurious lifestyle of an unemployed fraud and a severe drug addict. But why would the bank ever allow this to happen? Calvin wheezed, his voice completely stripped of its usual booming patriarchal authority. He sounded like a terrified child. They require my physical signature and verbal authorization to release any sum over $10,000. The bank has my signature card on file. How did Connor bypass the security protocols? That is exactly the most interesting part of this entire tragic story. Julian said, a dark, humorless smirk crossing his face. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a single laminated sheet of paper. It was a high-resolution, magnified copy of the original bank wire authorization form. Look very closely at the authorization signature on the bottom right corner of that page, Calvin Julian instructed, pointing a long, precise finger at the copied document. Connor is a finance industry insider. He knew exactly what internal loopholes to exploit to bypass the verbal phone verification. He filled out the entire wire transfer form himself. But he did not forge your signature to finalize the massive theft. He had someone else do it. Calvin snatched the laminated paper from Julian's hand. He brought it inches from his face, his eyes frantically scanning the ink strokes. He stared at the signature, claiming to be his own. The forger had tried their absolute best to mimic his cursive style, but the subtle slant of the letters and the very specific way the tail of the final letter looped upward completely betrayed the actual author. It was a handwriting Calvin had seen thousands of times over the last 3 decades. He had seen that exact same loop on homemade Father's Day cards. He had seen that exact same slant on high school homework assignments and college application essays. It was undeniably, unmistakably Chloe's handwriting. The golden child, the daughter he favored above all else, the daughter whose lighter complexion he proudly paraded around his elitist social circles, had personally forged his signature. She had systematically robbed him of his entire retirement fund, and then she had immediately run home to put on a theatrical crying performance, framing the dark-skinned sister he already looked down upon. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of it tore through Calvin's mind, completely shredding the false reality he had fiercely protected for years. Calvin's eyes flooded with thick, angry red blood vessels. His breathing became heavy, erratic, and ragged, echoing loudly in the secluded alcove. He gripped the forged document so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. His chest heaved up and down like a volcano, on the absolute verge of a catastrophic eruption. The crushing weight of his own profound stupidity and the horrific betrayal of his favorite child was finally crashing down on him all at once. Julian watched Calvin struggle to breathe, his eyes locked on the forged signature of his favorite daughter. But the ruthless corporate lawyer was far from finished. He reached into the dark depths of his briefcase one last time. "I told you to sit down, Calvin," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Because the trust fund was just their personal piggy bank. Now we need to talk about your actual life savings." Julian pulled out a thick, red tabbed folder. This was the definitive kill shot. 3 years ago, you transferred full custodial rights of your primary retirement portfolio over to Vanguard Investments, Julian stated, tapping the heavy file. But what you actually did was hand a multi-million-dollar nest egg over to Connor. You gave a mediocre junior analyst complete unrestricted access to your entire life's work simply because he wore a Brooks Brothers suit and possessed the right skin color to make you feel adjacent to elite wealth. You trusted his whiteness and his arrogant finance bro vocabulary over the seasoned financial advisors you had used for decades. Calvin looked up from the forged document, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Connor manages that portfolio. He sends me the quarterly statements himself." The fund is up 12% this year. We just discussed the yields at dinner last month. Julian let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He handed the red folder to Calvin. Those quarterly statements were completely fabricated, Calvin. Connor created fake spreadsheets on his laptop to keep you quiet. I pulled the actual certified bank records directly from the clearinghouse this morning. Open the folder and look at the bottom line on the final page. Calvin's trembling hands practically tore the folder open. He flipped past pages of dense financial jargon and highlighted transaction logs until he reached the final certified summary sheet. His eyes darted to the bold numbers at the very bottom of the page. He stopped breathing entirely. Zero. The account balance was exactly $0.00. There was over $1.2 million in that portfolio, Julian explained, his voice echoing off the sterile walls of the hospital alcove. Connor did not just make a few bad trades in a bear market. He liquidated your blue-chip stocks and funneled the cash into incredibly reckless offshore cryptocurrency scams, trying to chase a massive payout. When those completely tanked, he panicked. He started pulling cash advances against your portfolio to fund high-stakes sports betting and illegal gambling syndicates in Las Vegas, hoping to win back the losses before you noticed. Brenda let out a high-pitched wail, clutching her chest, as if she were having a heart attack. $1.2 million, she screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor. Calvin, tell me he is lying. Tell me our money is still there. Calvin could not speak. He was staring at the paper, his mind completely fracturing under the weight of the absolute betrayal. His entire identity was tied to his wealth. His status as a respected elder in their affluent church, his country club memberships, his arrogant ability to look down on people who worked in public service like me, it was all funded by that retirement account. And now it was completely gone. He was destitute. He lost every single penny, Calvin, Julian said, delivering the final devastating blow. Connor was fired from his firm 6 months ago for unauthorized trading. He is currently under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Your son-in-law is a broke, desperate, degenerate gambler, and because you legally signed over custodial power to him, the bank holds you completely responsible for the margin calls. You are entirely bankrupt. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I watched my father process the reality that the golden child and the perfect white son-in-law he had chosen over me had methodically bled him completely dry. The sheer psychological break happening behind his eyes was terrifying to witness. Suddenly, a primal, guttural roar erupted from Calvin's chest. It was not the sound of a dignified, wealthy patriarch. It was the sound of a completely broken man who had just lost his entire reason for living. He dropped the heavy financial files, letting the papers scatter all over the linoleum floor. "Where is he?" Calvin roared, his face turning a terrifying shade of dark purple. "Where is that pathetic piece of trash?" Before anyone could stop him, Calvin spun around and sprinted out of the secluded alcove. He was moving with a violent, chaotic energy, completely ignoring Brenda's frantic screams for him to stop. I immediately stepped out of the alcove to follow him, with Julian walking calmly right beside me. I did not want to stop my father. I wanted a front row seat to the absolute destruction of their fake, perfect family. Calvin stormed down the main corridor, pushing past a startled nurse carrying a tray of medications. He burst through the heavy double doors of the surgical intensive care unit waiting area. Connor was standing near the vending machines holding a stale cup of hospital coffee and aggressively scrolling through his phone, probably trying to find a sleazy bankruptcy lawyer who would work for free. Connor looked up just as Calvin charged across the waiting room. The younger man barely had time to register the pure homicidal rage on his father-in-law's face before Calvin was entirely upon him. Calvin did not yell. He did not ask for an explanation. He lunged forward with both hands out violently, shoving Connor backward. The forceful impact sent Connor crashing into the heavy glass front of the vending machine. The glass cracked loudly under his weight, and the hot coffee splashed all over his expensive tailored shirt. "You stole my life," Calvin screamed, his voice echoing through the entire intensive care ward. "You stole everything I ever worked for, you parasitic garbage." Connor scrambled to regain his balance, his eyes wide with sudden absolute terror. "Calvin, wait," he stammered, putting his hands up defensively. "I can explain. The market took a bad turn. I was going to earn it all back. I just needed a little more time to flip the investments." Calvin did not hesitate. He lunged forward again this time, wrapping both of his large hands directly around Connor's throat. He squeezed with a terrifying primal strength, lifting the younger man slightly onto his tiptoes and slamming his head back against the metal frame of the vending machine. Connor's hands immediately flew up to claw desperately at Calvin's wrists. His face began to turn a bright, blotchy red as his airway was completely crushed. He kicked his expensive leather shoes against the hospital floor, gasping frantically for air that could not reach his lungs. "Give me my money back," Calvin roared, spit flying from his lips. "You stole my retirement. You made my daughter forge my signature. I will kill you right here. I will snap your neck, you worthless fraud." Brenda came sprinting into the waiting area, her expensive heels slipping on the polished floor. She let out a blood-curdling shriek when she saw her husband actively strangling their son-in-law. "Calvin, stop it!" she shrieked, throwing herself at his back and desperately trying to pull his arms away. "You are going to go to prison. Let him go." But Calvin was completely lost to the rage. He easily shoved Brenda off him, sending her tumbling to the floor. Her perfectly styled hair fell out of its expensive updo, and her designer dress tangled around her knees. She sat on the floor sobbing hysterically, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The scene was absolute pure chaos. The perfect affluent church family, the people who had always sneered at anyone who did not meet their impossible social standards, were currently engaged in a violent physical brawl in the middle of a public hospital. They looked exactly like the trashy reality television shows they always claimed to despise. They were a complete circus, and every single nurse, doctor, and patient in the waiting room was watching them self-destruct. I stood near the entrance doors, my arms crossed over my white doctor coat, watching the man who had thrown me out into the snow actively try to murder the man he had chosen to replace me. I felt absolutely no urge to intervene. I felt no panic. Julian stood right next to me, a calm, satisfied smirk playing on his lips, as he watched the legal and financial traps he had laid spring perfectly shut. Hospital security guards finally rushed into the room. 3 large men in uniforms sprinted toward the vending machines, grabbing Calvin by the shoulders and forcefully ripping him away from Connor. Calvin thrashed wildly, kicking and screaming obscenities as the guards pinned his arms behind his back. Connor collapsed onto the floor, coughing violently and gasping for air. He was clutching his bruised throat, tears streaming down his face. His expensive suit was torn and soaked in cheap coffee. He looked pathetic. He looked like the absolute coward he truly was. "Call the police!" Connor wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Calvin. "He just tried to murder me. I want him arrested for attempted murder." Calvin strained against the security guards, his eyes bulging with pure hatred. "Go ahead and call them, you thief," Calvin screamed back. "Because the second they get here, I am having you arrested for grand larceny, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse. You are going to rot in federal prison for the rest of your miserable life." I looked down at Brenda, who was still sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the scattered financial documents that proved their absolute ruin. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for some kind of intervention, some kind of daughterly sympathy. But there was none left to give. The well had run completely dry 2 years ago. This is what happens when you build your entire life on lies and colorism. I said, my voice slicing clearly through the chaos of the room. You chose the shiny fake gold over the real thing, and now you get to choke on it. The hospital security guards firmly escorted a shouting Calvin out of the waiting area, holding his arms locked tightly behind his back. He was screaming wildly about his stolen money until the heavy double doors swung shut, cutting off his voice entirely. Connor remained on the floor, coughing up the last of the cheap coffee that had spilled all over him. He slowly dragged himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the cracked glass of the vending machine. He did not ask how Chloe was doing. He did not ask if her $80,000 leg surgery had been successful. He simply looked at the scattered financial documents on the floor and realized his massive con was completely over. I need to get out of here. Connor muttered, his voice hoarse and raspy from being violently strangled. He adjusted his torn suit jacket, refusing to look at my mother. The Securities and Exchange Commission is going to freeze my personal accounts by tomorrow morning. I need to pack my bags right now. Brenda looked up from the floor, her tear-streaked face twisting in sudden panic. Connor, where are you going? She pleaded, reaching a trembling manicured hand toward him. Chloe is still in the intensive care unit. She is going to wake up soon. She needs her husband. We need you to fix this massive mess with the bank. Connor let out a dark, bitter laugh. Fix it, he coughed, wiping coffee from his chin. There is absolutely nothing left to fix, Brenda. The money is gone, and I am not sticking around to take the fall for your delusional family or your drug-addicted daughter. Tell Chloe I will have my lawyers send the divorce papers directly to her hospital bed. I am leaving the country tonight. He did not look back. The arrogant white finance bro who had systematically destroyed my family turned on his heel and limped quickly down the hospital corridor, abandoning his injured wife and his ruined in-laws without a single ounce of remorse. Brenda watched him leave, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The grand illusion of her high society life was rapidly evaporating right before her eyes. Julian stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes stepping carefully over the scattered financial papers. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out one final document perfectly folded. He crouched down slightly to hand it to my mother. I strongly suggest you start packing your things as well, Brenda. Julian said, his voice impeccably polite, but entirely devoid of any warmth. I found this filed in the county public records yesterday morning. Since Calvin recklessly used the deed to your sprawling colonial home as collateral to cover Connor's massive gambling debts last month, the bank has officially initiated foreclosure proceedings. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the property before the sheriff's department physically removes you from the premises. Brenda took the paper with trembling hands. She unfolded it and read the bold legal print at the top of the page. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Her eyes widened in absolute sheer horror. The sprawling 4-bedroom estate with the manicured lawn and the heated swimming pool, the absolute center of her entire fake social universe, was being violently ripped away from her. She was going to be homeless. The wealthy friends she had spent decades trying to impress at the country club would completely ostracize her the second they found out she was utterly broke. The crushing reality of her complete destitution finally broke her. Brenda dropped the foreclosure notice. She scrambled across the hard linoleum floor on her hands and knees, completely abandoning whatever dignity she had left. She crawled directly toward me, reaching out with desperate, grasping hands. Before I could step back, she threw her arms around my legs, burying her tear-soaked face into the fabric of my navy blue medical scrubs. She gripped my pant legs so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "Simone, please," she wailed, her voice echoing with a raw, pathetic desperation that made my skin crawl. "Please, my beautiful baby girl, you have to help us. You heard Julian. We are going to lose the house. We have absolutely nothing left." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. This was the exact same woman who had looked at my dark skin and natural hair 2 years ago and called me a dark stain on her perfect family. This was the woman who had gleefully thrown my expensive medical textbooks into the freezing snow and told me I was a complete failure. And now she was groveling on the dirty hospital floor, begging for a financial lifeline. "You have all that money, Simone," she sobbed, her expensive makeup smearing violently against my scrubs. "You just paid $80,000 for Chloe's leg without even blinking. Julian is a millionaire lawyer. You live in a massive mansion. Please just pay off the bank for us. Buy the house back. You cannot let your own mother and father become homeless. We are your family, Simone. We are your own flesh and blood. Blood is thicker than water. You have to forgive us." I stared down at her, watching her weaponize the concept of family only when it directly benefited her bank account. She did not care about the agonizing emotional pain she caused me. She did not care that I had starved and struggled to finish medical school entirely alone. She only cared that my bank account was currently large enough to save her from public humiliation. I felt Julian step close behind me, his presence a silent, unwavering pillar of support. I did not need him to intervene. I had waited 2 long, agonizing years for this exact moment. I aggressively jerked my leg backward, ripping my scrubs out of her desperate grip. Brenda lost her balance and slumped forward onto the hard floor, her hands landing flat against the cold tiles. "Blood!" I asked, my voice slicing through the air like a sterile scalpel cutting through dead tissue. "You want to talk to me about blood and family right now?" I took a step back, looking down at her pathetic, trembling form with absolute clinical disgust. Where was that blood loyalty 2 years ago, Brenda? Where was my family the day I graduated at the absolute top of my surgical residency program? I will tell you exactly where. You were busy getting hot stone massages at a luxury spa with Chloe celebrating her new stolen sports car. Where was my family the day I walked down the aisle and married Julian? You and Calvin were busy hosting a lavish backyard barbecue for Connor, showing off your perfect white son-in-law to the entire neighborhood. Brenda looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading, fresh tears streaming down her ruined face. "Simone, please, we made a terrible mistake." It was not a mistake, I snapped, cutting her off completely. It was a calculated choice. You made your choice the night you threw me out into that blizzard. You chose your lighter-skinned lying daughter and her fraudulent husband because they fit your pathetic superficial aesthetic. You decided that my dark skin and my honesty were not good enough for your perfect country club family. You happily discarded me like garbage to protect a lie. I adjusted my crisp, white doctor coat and looked at her one last time, erasing every single trace of her from my heart. You do not get to come crawling back to me just because your shiny, fake gold turned out to be completely toxic. You do not get to claim me as your loving daughter now that I am powerful and wealthy. As far as I am concerned, the parents who raised me died 2 years ago in that freezing snowstorm. I have no family sitting on this floor. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably in the waiting room, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of her own terrible choices. I did not look back. I walked down the bright hospital corridor with my husband right by my side, the rhythmic clicking of my shoes echoing with the sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. I walked away from my mother, leaving her sobbing on the cold linoleum floor of the waiting room. The sound of her desperate apologies faded into the background as the heavy double doors closed behind me. I felt a massive, crushing weight lift off my shoulders. For my entire life, I had carried the burden of trying to be good enough for people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. Now that burden was completely gone. Julian and I retreated to my private office at the end of the emergency department corridor. It was approaching 3 in the morning. The chaotic energy of the hospital had finally settled down into the eerie quiet of the graveyard shift. Julian was resting his eyes on the small leather sofa in the corner, his expensive suit jacket draped over the back of a chair. He had systematically destroyed my abusers with brilliant legal precision, and now he was giving me the space I needed to decompress. I sat at my desk sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee. My shift was technically over, but as the department head, I always stayed late to review the post-operative charts of my critical patients. I pulled up the digital telemetry dashboard on my computer screen. This system allowed me to monitor the real-time vital signs of every patient currently admitted to the surgical intensive care unit. I clicked on Chloe's profile. Her heart rate was steady. Her blood pressure was holding within a normal range for someone who had just undergone a major vascular bypass. But as I scrolled down the digital chart, a tiny yellow warning icon flashed in the corner of the screen. It was an automated alert from her patient-controlled analgesia pump. The PCA pump was the computerized medical device connected directly to her intravenous line. It was filled with a highly concentrated dose of liquid fentanyl designed to manage her severe post-surgical pain. The machine is strictly programmed with a hard lockout interval, so a patient cannot accidentally overdose themselves, no matter how many times they press the delivery button. I stared at the yellow warning icon. The digital log indicated that the physical security casing of the pump had been manually bypassed. Someone had accessed the administrative override menu. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. Nurses do not use the manual override in the middle of the night without logging a formal physician order. And Chloe was heavily sedated, practically unconscious. She could not possibly manipulate the complex digital keypad herself. I quickly minimized the medical chart and opened the hospital security network. As the department director, I had live access to the closed-circuit cameras installed in every intensive care suite. I typed in my credentials and brought up the high-definition camera feed for room 412. The room on the screen was dark, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the medical monitors, but there was a figure standing directly beside Chloe's bed. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing. It was a man wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt pulled up over his head, but the expensive leather dress shoes and the torn coffee-stained dress pants gave his identity away instantly. It was Connor. He had not fled the country. He had not gone to the airport. He was standing right there in the dark, hovering over his heavily sedated wife. I watched his movements through the grainy security feed. He was not holding her hand. He was not stroking her hair or whispering words of comfort. His entire focus was fixed on the glowing screen of the fentanyl pump. He had a small metal tool in his hand, likely a stolen screwdriver, and he was using it to pry open the clear plastic security box that protected the medication vial and the programming keypad. My mind raced, processing the incoming data with the cold, calculated speed of a trauma surgeon. Why was he here? He had just declared his absolute hatred for this family. He had admitted he was entirely broke and facing federal investigation. Julian had told him his accounts would be frozen by morning. He had absolutely no money to run away. And then the horrific realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Life insurance. 2 years ago, when Connor first married into the family, my father Calvin had proudly bragged about the massive comprehensive life insurance policies he had purchased for both of his daughters. The payout in the event of an accidental death was $1 million. Connor owed massive amounts of money to illegal gambling syndicates and loan sharks. Those were the kind of people who did not care about SEC investigations or frozen bank accounts. They wanted their cash, and they would resort to extreme violence to get it. Connor was a desperate, cornered animal. A sudden, tragic hospital overdose would completely solve all of his problems. If Chloe died tonight from a massive narcotic overdose, the authorities would look straight at her medical history. They would see the preliminary toxicology report, proving she was driving under the influence of cocaine. They would see her extensive history of using my stolen identity to buy illegal opioids. The police and the medical examiner would easily conclude that she was an active addict who simply figured out a way to break into her hospital pain pump and accidentally gave herself a lethal dose. It was the perfect crime. Connor would play the grieving, devastated widow. He would collect the $1 million tax-free insurance payout and disappear long before my ruined parents could ever prove a thing. He was completely willing to murder his own wife in cold blood to pay off his gambling debts. I watched the security feed as the plastic security casing finally popped open. Connor tossed the broken plastic onto the floor and quickly began punching numbers into the administrative keypad. He was reprogramming the machine. He was bypassing the safety lockouts and setting the pump to deliver a massive lethal bolus dose directly into her bloodstream. Given her compromised lung function and the trauma her body had just endured, a massive hit of fentanyl would cause respiratory depression within 30 seconds. Her breathing would slow down and completely stop. Her brain would be starved of oxygen, and her heart would go into fatal cardiac arrest. He was going to kill her right in front of me. I did not scream. I did not panic. I calmly reached across my desk and grabbed my heavy hospital master keycard. I stood up and lightly tapped Julian on the shoulder. He woke up instantly, his sharp eyes immediately assessing my face. "Connor is in her room," I whispered, my voice completely steady. "He is actively trying to murder her with the fentanyl pump. Call the police and get hospital security up to the 4th floor right now. Tell them we have a code silver in progress." Julian was on his feet before I even finished the sentence, pulling his phone from his pocket. I did not wait for him. I sprinted out of my office and ran down the empty hallway toward the elevators. The adrenaline was pumping so hard through my veins I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I took the stairs, taking them two at a time. I burst through the stairwell doors onto the 4th floor intensive care unit. The hallway was completely silent. The night nurses were gathered at the main station at the far end of the ward, reviewing charts, completely unaware that a homicide was currently taking place just 50 feet away. I did not call out to them. I needed to catch him exactly in the act. I needed absolute, undeniable proof, so he could never talk his way out of this with his expensive lawyers and his arrogant white privilege. I moved silently down the corridor, my rubber-soled surgical shoes making absolutely no sound on the polished floors. I approached the glass door of room 412. The blinds were drawn, but through the small gap in the slats, I could see the glow of the medical equipment. I pressed my back against the wall right next to the door, holding my breath. I carefully peeked through the narrow gap. Connor was leaning directly over the bed. His face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of the pump display. His expression was completely blank. There was no hesitation, there was no remorse. He looked like a man making a routine ATM withdrawal. He reached out his index finger, hovering directly over the flashing green confirmation button. Once he pressed that button, the machine would instantly inject the lethal dose of fentanyl into her intravenous line. I gripped the heavy metal handle of the hospital door. I swiped my master keycard over the electronic lock. The light flashed green with a soft click. Connor's finger pressed down on the button. I shoved the heavy door open with all of my strength. I reached my hand inside and slammed my palm violently against the main wall switch. The room instantly flooded with blinding, brilliant white light. The sudden blinding light made Connor flinch violently. He snatched his hand back from the fentanyl pump as if he had just touched a burning stove. He spun around, his eyes wide with the frantic terror of a trapped animal caught completely off guard. He squinted against the harsh fluorescent bulbs of the intensive care unit, trying to make sense of the sudden intrusion. "What are you doing in here?" he stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. He tried to quickly take a step away from the medical equipment, casually sliding his hands into the pockets of his torn suit pants. "I was just checking on her." The machine was making a weird beeping noise. "I think it is broken." I did not blink. I stepped fully into the room, blocking the only exit. I crossed my arms over my crisp white doctor coat and stared at him with absolute clinical disgust. "You were not checking on her, Connor," I said, my voice projecting with the cold, unwavering authority of a judge handing down a death sentence. "You broke open the physical security casing of a controlled substance pump. You manipulated the administrative keypad, and you were exactly 1 second away from injecting a massive lethal bolus of fentanyl directly into her bloodstream. You were trying to murder your own wife in cold blood to collect a $1 million life insurance payout because you owe money to the mob." Connor let out a nervous, breathless laugh that sounded more like a wet gasp. His eyes darted frantically around the room. "You are completely crazy, Simone," he deflected, leaning hard into his usual strategy of gaslighting and denial. "You have always been delusional. You are just making things up because you are jealous of our perfect marriage. I am calling hospital security right now to have you permanently removed from this floor." "I do not think you will need to call them," I replied, stepping slightly to the side. Right on cue, two large individuals wearing blue hospital scrub jackets stepped into the room right behind me. They had been sitting quietly at the main nurses' station all night, pretending to update medical charts and drink stale coffee. Julian, with his extensive high-level connections in the district attorney's office, had arranged for them to be stationed on the surgical floor the absolute second we discovered Connor's financial ruin and the life insurance policy. They were not nurses. The two men simultaneously reached inside their scrub jackets and pulled out heavy silver police badges attached to thick leather chains. Atlanta Police Department, the taller officer barked, his voice shattering the remaining quiet of the hospital room. Step away from the patient and keep your hands exactly where I can see them. The arrogant finance bro facade that Connor had worn for years completely and instantly disintegrated. He looked at the open door, he looked at the two armed officers, and then he made the absolute dumbest decision of his entire miserable life. He lunged toward the heavy glass window at the back of the room, desperately looking for a fire escape or a ledge. He did not even make it 2 steps. The undercover officers moved with terrifying tactical speed. One officer lunged forward, grabbing Connor roughly by the shoulder and violently spinning him around. The second officer swept his legs completely out from under him. Connor hit the hard linoleum floor with a sickening heavy thud that knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. He thrashed and kicked wildly, screaming about his civil rights and demanding to call his expensive lawyers. "Stop resisting," the taller officer commanded, driving a heavy knee directly into the center of Connor's back to pin him to the floor. He forcefully yanked Connor's arms behind his back, twisting his wrists at an agonizing angle. The sharp metallic click of the solid steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. It was without a doubt the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. "Connor, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Chloe Hayes," the officer stated, pulling him up by the chain of the cuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The violent physical struggle, the shouting, and the reading of the Miranda rights finally broke through the heavy wall of surgical sedatives keeping my sister asleep. Chloe's eyes fluttered open, blinking rapidly against the blinding overhead lights. She let out a confused, groggy moan and slowly turned her head toward the center of the room. She did not see a phantom black woman in a beat-up Honda driving her off the road. She did not see a jealous, dark-skinned sister creeping into her room to poison her IV bags. She saw her perfect, wealthy, white husband, the man she had weaponized against her own family, the man she had worshipped and used to humiliate me, pinned face down against a hospital bed by 2 armed police officers. His torn, coffee-stained suit was wrinkled. His face was bruised from where my father had strangled him earlier, and he was sobbing uncontrollably, like a terrified, pathetic child. "What is happening?" Chloe croaked, her voice weak, raspy, and filled with genuine confusion. "Connor, what are they doing to you? Why are the police here?" I walked slowly over to the side of her hospital bed. I leaned down and picked up the broken pieces of the plastic security casing that Connor had pried off the fentanyl pump. I held the shattered plastic up right in front of her face so she could clearly see the physical evidence. "Your perfect husband just broke into your pain management pump, Chloe." I explained, my tone completely devoid of any sisterly warmth or pity. "He used a stolen tool to bypass the digital safety protocols. He was about to flood your heart with enough raw fentanyl to kill a horse. He is entirely broke. He lost all of Dad's retirement money to illegal gambling syndicates, and he came in here tonight to execute you in your sleep so he could collect your life insurance policy and run away." Chloe stared at the broken plastic in my hand, and then her wide, terrified eyes darted down to Connor. The sheer impossibility of the situation was short-circuiting her brain. "Connor, tell her she is lying." Chloe begged, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Tell them you are just trying to fix the machine. Tell them you love me." But Connor did not look at her. He did not profess his undying eternal love or declare his absolute innocence to his injured wife. He did not even acknowledge her presence in the room. He looked up at the police officers with tears streaming down his face and instantly started trying to save his own skin. "If I cooperate right now, will the district attorney offer me a plea deal?" Connor whimpered, completely ignoring his wife's desperate pleas. I can give you names. I know the guys running the illegal sports books downtown. I can give you the whole syndicate operations. Just please do not put me in a maximum security prison block. I will tell you everything you want to know. The sound of his pathetic, cowardly bargaining was the final fatal blow. Chloe's entire narcissistic reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the hospital bed. The man she had chosen over her own sister, the man she had helped steal from our father, the man she had proudly paraded around country clubs to validate her own superiority, had just casually traded her life for a gambling debt. And now he was actively trying to trade his criminal friends for a lighter prison sentence. She was absolutely nothing to him. She had never been anything to him but a convenient financial pawn and a disposable asset. All the lies she had told, all the manipulation she had orchestrated, all the people she had destroyed to build her perfect, flawless image. It had all been for absolutely nothing. She had married a monster who was far worse than the fake monster she had pretended I was. Chloe let out a devastating hollow wail. It was not the fake manipulative crying she always used to get her way with our parents. It was the agonizing guttural sound of a woman who had just realized her entire life was a massive toxic lie, and she was now completely and utterly alone in the world. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing so hard her monitors began to beep wildly. The police officers hauled Connor roughly to his feet, ignoring his pathetic whimpering. He did not even glance at Chloe as they marched him aggressively out of the intensive care unit, his head hung low in absolute total disgrace. The heavy glass door slid shut with a soft hiss, leaving me entirely alone in the room, with the sister who had spent her entire life trying to destroy me. I stood at the foot of her bed watching her cry. 2 years ago, her tears had been the weapon that got me thrown out into a freezing blizzard. Now her tears were just the pathetic aftermath of her own self-destruction. I reached into the deep pocket of my white doctor coat, my fingers brushing against the thick, folded stack of papers. The police had taken care of Connor and his attempted murder charge, but I still had her undeniable toxicology report and a drafted federal lawsuit for severe identity theft burning a hole in my pocket. It was finally my turn to finish this. The morning sun pierced through the sterile blinds of the intensive care unit. I walked into room 412 for the very last time. Chloe was wide awake. The heavy surgical sedatives had completely worn off, leaving her in raw, agonizing physical pain. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological hell she was currently living in. Her husband was sitting in a county jail cell. Her parents were completely bankrupt, and she was trapped in a hospital bed with a newly reconstructed leg staring at the ceiling in complete despair. I did not wear my white doctor coat this time. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, the kind of suit a wealthy executive wears when they are closing a massive corporate acquisition. I walked over to the side of her bed, and I did not ask her how she was feeling. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out 3 thick, heavy stacks of legal documents. I tossed them onto the thin hospital blanket right over her lap. They landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. Chloe flinched, her eyes darting from the papers up to my face. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of panic. "That is your new reality, Chloe," I answered, my voice calm and completely detached. "The first stack is your finalized hospital bill. The total comes to exactly $412,000. The vascular grafts, the intensive care suite, the trauma surgeons, it all adds up incredibly fast when you do not have health insurance." "I do have insurance," she cried out desperately, clutching the blanket. "Connor set up a premium policy for us last year." I shook my head slowly, giving her a cold, pitying look. "Connor let that policy lapse 3 months ago. But even if it was active, they would not have paid a single dime. I personally submitted your preliminary toxicology report to the insurance underwriters early this morning. You were driving a vehicle with 3 times the legal limit of alcohol and a massive amount of cocaine in your bloodstream. That completely voids any and all medical coverage. You are personally responsible for every single penny of that massive debt." Chloe let out a choked gasp, staring down at the bill. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. The second stack, I continued, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the next pile of papers, is the official notice of foreclosure on Mom and Dad's house. Because they allowed your wonderful husband to use their estate as collateral for his illegal gambling debts, the bank has officially seized the property. They are being evicted at the end of the month. They have absolutely nowhere to go and zero money to their names. Tears began to stream down her bruised face, dropping onto the crisp white paper. "Simone, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I have nothing. Connor left me with absolutely nothing. I cannot pay this. You have to help me. I am your sister." I ignored her pathetic plea entirely and pointed to the final stack of documents. The third stack is a civil lawsuit filed directly by Vanguard Legal Group on my behalf. We are officially suing you for aggravated identity theft and medical fraud. We have undeniable proof that you used my name and my medical credentials to illegally purchase highly addictive opioids from shady pain clinics all over the state of Georgia. You weaponized my identity to feed your addiction, and you used that same addiction to get me thrown out of the family. Now you are going to face the federal consequences. Chloe completely broke down. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically, shaking so hard the medical monitors began to chime. She was drowning in a bottomless ocean of legal and financial ruin, and there was absolutely no one left to throw her a life preserver. I stood there and watched her cry for a long moment. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no lingering familial obligation. I had done my job. I had fulfilled my Hippocratic oath. "I saved your life in that operating room, Chloe," I said, my voice slicing clearly through her loud sobs. "I put your shattered bones back together, and I kept your heart beating, because that is my absolute duty as a physician. I saved your life. But I will absolutely not save you from the consequences of your own evil actions. You built this hell entirely by yourself." I turned around and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back over my shoulder one final time. Good luck in federal court, and good luck in absolute poverty. Do not ever say my name or try to contact me again. I walked out of the room and let the heavy glass door slide shut forever. The drive home from the hospital that morning was the most peaceful commute of my entire life. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool Atlanta breeze wash over my face. I watched the city wake up, the morning commuters rushing to their jobs, completely unaware of the massive shift that had just occurred in my universe. For the first time in 35 years, the heavy, suffocating cloud of my parents' expectations and my sister's toxic jealousy was completely gone. I was finally free. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air blew through the open windows of our new home. It was a sprawling 6-bedroom estate in one of the most exclusive gated communities in Atlanta. I was standing in my massive custom kitchen, the morning sunlight pouring across the white marble countertops. I took a slow sip of my warm chamomile tea, letting the peaceful silence of the house wash over me. I looked across the hallway into the newly painted nursery. Julian was wearing a casual gray shirt, sitting on the plush carpet and meticulously assembling a wooden crib. He had a pencil tucked behind his ear and a look of absolute focused determination on his handsome face. I smiled, resting a hand on my growing belly. Our first child, a beautiful baby girl, was due in just 3 months. She was going to be born into a home filled with unconditional love, respect, and absolute safety. She would never know the toxic, conditional love that I had been forced to endure. The contrast between my beautiful life and the lives of the people who threw me away was staggering. Calvin and Brenda were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment in a rundown public housing complex on the outskirts of the city. Their wealthy country club friends had completely abandoned them the second the bank foreclosed on their estate. The massive shame and public humiliation had aged them both terribly. They spent their days sitting in a tiny living room, blaming each other for their absolute ruin. They had tried to call me a dozen times from various unknown numbers, begging for a loan. I blocked every single one. Connor was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The illegal gambling syndicate he owed money to had happily provided the district attorney with all the evidence needed to lock him away for multiple counts of wire fraud and attempted murder. He was exactly where a cowardly racist parasite belonged. And Chloe was under strict house arrest, wearing a heavy black ankle monitor, while she awaited her federal trial for identity theft and prescription fraud. She was living in a cheap motel room on the wrong side of town, drowning in over $500,000 of medical and legal debt. She spent her days entirely alone, trapped in a tiny room, staring at the peeling wallpaper. She had absolutely no husband to manipulate, no rich parents to bail her out, and no golden child status to hide behind anymore. She was finally forced to sit in complete silence and face the ugly, broken reality of who she truly was. I took another sip of my tea, closing my eyes, and breathing in the sweet scent of vanilla and fresh cedar drifting from the nursery. I felt a soft, gentle flutter against my ribs. The baby was kicking. I placed my hand over my stomach, smiling warmly. Julian looked up from the crib, catching my eye and returning the smile with a look of pure, absolute adoration. We had built our own beautiful kingdom entirely from scratch. I had won the ultimate war. But the most beautiful part was that I did not win by destroying them. The absolute best revenge is never about screaming or aggressively ruining the people who hurt you. The best revenge is simply stepping completely out of their way and letting them destroy themselves with their own lies, greed, and toxic vanity. You just focus on protecting your peace, holding your boundaries firmly, and stepping gracefully into your ultimate glory. Have you ever had to permanently cut off a toxic family member to protect your own sanity and your future? It is one of the hardest but most necessary decisions a person can make. How did you find the courage to finally walk away? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about healing, setting unbreakable boundaries, and taking back your absolute power. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Protect it at all costs.